Non-chemical weed control for crops is gaining ground as growers respond to expanding lists of herbicide-resistant weeds, legislative bans of existing herbicides and consumer demand. An industry and SFFF-funded program, A Lighter Touch, uses existing tools and ecological processes for food production. Charles Murfield heads the Future Farming Centre and is an advisor to the program.
The Lighter Touch is a horticultural and arable industry 7-year, $27 million project looking at how to reduce agrochemical use in the production sectors, in the cropping sectors. Agroecology is essentially farming through an ecological mindset. It started as a science over a century ago, essentially studying farming through an ecological lens. Then they actually started doing farming with an ecological mindset. And then in about the 1980s, somebody kind of started noticing that farming's only half of the food system. You've got distribution, retail, consumption, all that side. So it then expanded across the whole food system rather than just inside the farm gate, and has also then become essentially a social and political movement. So it's kind of several different things wrapped up in one. The arable and horticultural industry is very clear they have to reduce their pesticide use, including the herbicides as well. So they're losing pesticides to evolved resistance, particularly in the weeds and the herbicides in New Zealand. Globally, there's as much resistance in fungicides and insecticides. Also very clear consumers are not excited by the idea of agrochemicals being used for their food production. We're also seeing very few new chemicals coming on in terms of new modes of action, particularly in the herbicides. So there's kind of a massive crunch point coming on between resistance, lack of new chemistry, resistant customers, and following the resistant customers legislation banning products. So their range of tools they've got in terms of chemistry just keeps shrinking and shrinking. So they need alternatives. The issue around herbicide resistance is really driving this now. I mean, for example, in viticulture, nationally, a third of vineyards have got glyphosate-resistant ryegrass on them. Marlborough, it's half of them. And they have virtually one other chemical option that they can use, and they will have resistance to that if they overuse it. So they're literally running out of chemical road in some industries. The arable industry's also got about 25 to 30 herbicide-resistant weeds across the arable systems as well. So they're simply finding the chemicals are not doing the job anymore. And so if chemicals aren't doing it, what's the answer? Non-chemical, which is kind of a really, covers all kinds of approaches, from, machinery through to the agroecological techniques, using things such as undersowing cereal crops. So when you harvest them, there's something already growing on the ground that can be then grazed, or protecting the soil from intense rainfall, as we've been hearing about recently. All these techniques need to be brought together to not only just address the issues around pesticides, but farming system resilience as a whole. I've just written this paper called Redefining Weeds for the Post-Herbicide Era. And in intensive agriculture, what we've been doing for the last 70-odd years, post the Second World War, it's basically the view that the only good plant in a paddock was the crop, and everything else was a weed, and we had to get rid of it. And the kind of mark of a good farm was the fact they had clean fields with nothing but crop in them. What we're realising now is that not all non-crop plants are actually harmful. It's actually a very small range of non-crop plants that are damaging, and therefore what I would now define as a weed. So it's kind of divvying plants up into these three classes, kind of the crop, the weeds that cause real harm, and then those non-crop plants that are just out there. But they're also giving benefits. So those non-crop, non-harmful plants are actually helping soil biology, and then they can provide things such as nectar and pollen to beneficial insects that will come and control the pests on the crop. New Zealand's got a slightly smaller range of options because we're the last bus stop on the planet in terms of machinery, and most of this stuff's been coming out of Europe. But we've had now 50 plus years of organic farms across the world, and at scale, figuring out how to manage weeds without herbicides. So there's a massive range of equipment, ideas, techniques, the whole shooting match really. Now, particularly in New Zealand's, generally benign climate, managing weeds without herbicides is entirely feasible. So we've got a whole range of organic cropping farmers up and down the country doing really great jobs with weed management with no herbicides for decades.
That kale, it's probably a bit thick, isn't it?
Depends what you want to do with it afterwards, I guess.
Yeah. Our farm's called Harts Creek Farm. and I'm a fourth generation to be here, and it's 180 hectares and it's a mixed cropping farm. We grow a range of crops. We grow brassicas, onions, carrots, cereal leaf for making smoothie mix powders, and we have sheep and cattle that grow echinacea and fennel, so it's quite a number of crops. With that number of crops, there's just weeding going on all the time, and especially with the brassicas, there's planting every 2 weeks, and so there's, weeding. So it's not like we try and get everything pretty much under control if we can before Christmas, and that sort of sets it up, sets the crops up. But with the brassicas that we're doing, it's pretty much all year round you're doing things. Regarding weed control, we don't have any primary bits of equipment. We have, I guess, best practice in our mind anyway of process, but I try and have as wide a range of machines here.
So if you're really wanting to do very shallow time weeding and very precise, that'll give you more than this. Thinking principally along arable, one of the key things is what I call a false seed bed, which is basically germinating and growing the weeds first and then growing the crop. And there's a series of different cultivators for doing the false seed beds. And then in arable, for actually weeding inside the crop, a machine called a spring tine weeder, which is kind of like a giant garden rake. There's lots of sprung wires that pull through the soil and uproot and break the little weed seedlings. And so you've got an arable crop that's bigger and tougher and surviving that. So that's a key machine there. But there's all kinds of other things, what the Americans call a rotary hoe, or what we call a spoon weeder here. There's machines designed for going through crops at later stages and cutting off fat-stemmed plants like thistles. And then there's all the inter-row hoeing. So if you're growing crops in rows, we've got a whole series of equipment and computer guidance systems now for coming through weeding between the rows and also weeding in the rows. So there's truly a ton of machinery and ideas and techniques out there.